Long after the last heat of day has left the sand, a low mound rises from the plain like the back of something sleeping. There is no gate here now, no market noise, no footsteps moving through narrow streets. Only wind passes over the broken earth, brushing against dry grass, scattered stones, and small pieces of clay that catch the moonlight for a moment, then disappear again into shadow. In southern Mesopotamia, many ancient cities do not announce themselves with walls or towers. They survive as tells, quiet hills made from the ruins of lives stacked upon lives. A house collapses, another is built above it. A temple floor is buried, then raised again. Generations pass, and the city slowly becomes a mound, holding its own memory inside the dust. At night, such a place can feel less like an archaeological site and more like a sealed thought. Somewhere beneath the surface may be the outline of an old courtyard, the edge of a baked brick, the remains of a room where someone once pressed a reed into wet clay. The hand is gone, the voice is gone, but the marks may still be there, waiting in darkness. This is where the oldest questions begin to breathe softly, not in a loud discovery, not in a dramatic revelation, but in the strange patience of the earth. The desert covers what people forget. It softens sharp corners, it breaks names apart, yet it also protects. A tablet dropped, buried, or abandoned can sleep for thousands of years beneath mud and dust, carrying words no living mouth has spoken since the world was young. Above it, the moon keeps watch without understanding the names below, and the wind moves on as if guarding them from noise. And if the records are right, some of those words remembered kings who ruled before a great flood, before the familiar ages, before the stories were gathered into later books, before history became a straight line. Here, under the quiet mound, the past does not feel finished. It feels buried, listening, and still holding its breath. During the earliest excavations in Mesopotamia, many workers searching through the earth did not yet understand how old the objects around them truly were. They uncovered broken walls, fragments of statues, jars collapsed into dust, and thousands of hardened clay tablets scattered beneath ruined temples and forgotten rooms. Some tablets cracked apart. Others remained sealed beneath layers of mud that had protected them for centuries beyond counting. At first glance, the tablets seemed fragile and unimpressive. They were small enough to hold in one hand, marked with narrow wedge-shaped impressions pressed carefully into wet clay. Yet those marks carried entire worlds inside them. They preserved trade records, prayers, royal names, temple offerings, and stories copied again and again by ancient scribes, who believed memory itself was sacred. Many of these tablets had rested underground since long before the rise of Greece or Rome. Some were already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were still young. They survived because clay, once baked by fire or hardened by dry earth, could outlast wood, cloth, and even empires. Libraries burned, kingdoms vanished, rivers changed course. Still the tablets endured in silence. There is something deeply human about this kind of survival. A king may build walls to resist enemies, but a scribe presses words into mud, hoping they will resist time. In the quiet rooms of Sumerian cities, men spent long hours copying signs beneath oil lamps, preserving lists of rulers and fragments of older traditions, whose origins they may not have fully understood themselves. And buried beneath those ruined cities, waiting under darkness and dust, some of those tablets carried stories of kings who were said to rule before the floodwaters came. For modern readers, the feeling can be intimate. A fingerprint left beside a cuneiform sign may remain visible after thousands of years, as if the ancient world briefly touched the present before retreating into shadow. The tablets do not speak loudly. They whisper through broken corners and faded lines, inviting listeners toward the hands that shaped them, the temples that stored them, and the vanished world they described. Among the recovered records of ancient Mesopotamia, few passages feel stranger than the lines describing the kings who ruled before the flood. The tablets speak with calm certainty, as though the scribes were recording something already accepted within their tradition. kingship, they wrote, descended from heaven. Then the first rulers governed from cities whose names still echo through archaeology and myth alike. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. What unsettles many modern readers is not only the idea of a world before a great flood, but the immense spans of time attached to those rulers. Some kings were said to reign for thousands of years. Others ruled for periods so vast they seemed to belong more to dreams than history. To modern historical thinking, such numbers appear impossible almost immediately, yet the ancient scribes continued preserving them. One interpretation is that the numbers were symbolic rather than literal, expressing sacred importance through enormous spans of time. Another possibility is that ancient people viewed the distant past differently than later civilizations did. The age before the flood may have represented a spiritual era, a world closer to divine order, where time itself carried another meaning. Scholars often approach these records carefully. The tablets do not prove that immortal rulers once governed forgotten continents beneath unfamiliar skies. At the same time, the existence of the records raises a quieter question. Why did multiple generations of scribes continue copying these traditions long after the supposed world of the pre-flood kings had vanished? Perhaps the mystery was never only about whether the kings existed exactly as written. Perhaps the deeper meaning rested in memory itself. Ancient civilizations may have believed humanity once lived through an age that ended in catastrophe, leaving behind only fragments carried into later history like pieces of driftwood after a storm. The names remained. The flood remained. And somewhere beneath the impossible numbers, the old records seem to insist that the world had once been different from the one we know now. You do not have to remember every name as it passes through the darkness. You do not have to hold every city, every number, every broken tablet in place. This story is old enough to be listened to the way one listens to rain at a window, or wind moving across an empty plain. Some details may stay with you, others may drift away, and that is all right. Ancient memory was never perfectly straight. It moved like water through generations, changing shape as it traveled, carrying pieces of truth, symbol, fear, hope, and sacred imagination. A king's name might survive while his city faded. A flood might remain in the mind of a people long after the exact year, place and scale had disappeared. What mattered was not always the sharp edge of fact, but the feeling that something profound had happened before ordinary history began. So as we move deeper into these buried records, let the mystery unfold slowly. Think of the old names as lanterns appearing one by one in a wide night. Alulim, Eridu, Shuruppak, Ziusudra. They do not need to be mastered. They only need to be heard, gently, as echoes from a world that ancient scribes believed was already ancient to them. There is comfort in this kind of listening. The past asks for attention, but not pressure. It invites the mind to wander through ruins, over riverbanks, across temple steps worn smooth by vanished feet. It allows the listener to rest while still traveling. If your thoughts loosen for a while, the story will still be here when you return, moving at the pace of dust, moonlight, and old water. Nothing is lost by listening softly tonight. The doorway opens now, quietly, before us, and beneath that rest, one question remains softly alive. If these people wrote of kings before the flood, if they preserved those names through clay, ritual, and repetition, then what kind of world were they trying not to forget? To follow that question, we must turn toward the records themselves, and toward the first kings written into Sumerian clay. Before the names of the flood kings could survive into the modern world, they first had to survive the fragile world of ancient Sumer. Long before museums, printed books, or digital archives, memory depended on the patience of scribes sitting inside temple complexes beside the slow rivers of Mesopotamia. In cities such as Uruk, Nippur, and Eridu, young scribes trained for years to master cuneiform writing. They pressed sharpened reeds into damp clay, repeating signs over and over until their hands learned movements precise enough to preserve contracts, prayers, hymns, taxes, offerings, and royal histories. The work demanded discipline and silence. A single tablet might contain only a few lines, yet those lines could carry the authority of a kingdom. To the people of Sumer, writing was not merely practical. It carried spiritual weight. Records helped maintain order between the human world and the divine world above it. Temples tracked harvests, rituals, debts, and dynasties, because civilization itself was understood as something delicate, something that could slip into chaos if memory failed. This may explain why the names of ancient rulers continued to be copied century after century, even when the earliest kings already belonged to a distant and uncertain age. A scribe pressing symbols into clay around 2,000 years before the birth of Christ might have been copying traditions already considered ancient in his own lifetime. There is a quiet intimacy in imagining those rooms. Oil lamps flickering against mud brick walls, reed baskets filled with tablets, dust gathering in corners while the sounds of distant markets drifted through open courtyards. Somewhere among those shelves rested lists of kings who were said to rule before the floodwaters changed the world. Although the cities above ground would eventually crack, sink, and disappear beneath layers of earth, the clay beneath them continued, waiting in darkness, carrying memory forward with remarkable patience. Perhaps that patience is part of why these records still feel strangely alive today. The tablets do not read like hurried announcements. They feel careful, ceremonial, almost protective, as though the scribes understood they were guarding the remains of an older world whose meaning had already begun fading into uncertainty. In the next lines, the names themselves begin to emerge from the clay. The first names appear quietly, without explanation, as though the ancient scribes expected their readers to recognize them already. Alulim, Alangar, Enmenlu-ana, Enmengal-ana. The names move across the clay in measured sequence, connected to cities that stood near the rivers of southern Mesopotamia long before later empires rose from the same earth. At the beginning of the Sumerian King List, kingship is said to descend from heaven into Eridu, a city many traditions remembered as the first settlement of civilization itself. To ancient Mesopotamians, Eridu was not simply another place on a map. It carried the atmosphere of an origin point, a sacred beginning where divine order first touched the human world. The kings associated with these early cities often seem suspended between humanity and myth. Their reigns stretch across impossible spans of time, yet their names were preserved with unusual consistency across multiple copies of the tradition. That persistence gives the records a strange emotional weight. Even if the numbers were symbolic, the memory behind them mattered deeply enough to survive generations of copying and recopying. For night listeners today, the names can feel distant and intimate at the same time. They arrive from a world almost entirely erased, and yet they still carry traces of human identity. Someone once spoke these names aloud beside temple walls and riverbanks. Someone believed they belonged in the story of civilization. Scholars often interpret the earliest portions of the King List as mythologized memory shaped by political and religious symbolism. The texts themselves do not provide modern historical proof for a literal pre-flood dynasty. Yet the emotional texture of the records remains difficult to ignore. The scribes did not treat these names casually. They preserved them with ceremony, placing them carefully at the beginning of history, before the flood divided the world into before and after. And perhaps that is part what makes the old records so compelling. They do not merely describe rulers, they describe humanity, trying to remember where order began. As the tablets continue, another idea slowly emerges beside the names themselves. The kings were not simply powerful men ruling cities beside rivers. According to the ancient tradition, kingship itself had descended from heaven. To the people who lived in ancient Sumer, kingship was not viewed as an invention created through politics alone. The earliest traditions describe it as something granted from above, descending into the world like a sacred responsibility. Before cities expanded across the plains of Mesopotamia, before walls rose beside the rivers, the records say that kingship came down from heaven. The phrase appears simple at first, yet it carries an atmosphere difficult to translate into modern thinking. Ancient societies often understood order itself as divine in origin. The movement of stars, the flooding of rivers, the changing of seasons, and the structure of civilization were all connected within a larger sacred pattern. A king was expected, not only to govern people, but to help maintain balance between the human world and the unseen powers believed to shape it. This may explain why the earliest rulers were remembered with such reverence. The King List does not present kingship as random or accidental. It moves carefully from city to city, almost like a sacred flame being carried across generations. Eridu receives kingship first. Later, it passes onward to other ancient centers. The transfer feels ceremonial, suggesting that authority itself belonged to something larger than any single ruler. Within temple culture, this idea shaped daily life. Priests observed rituals beneath towering structures built to connect earth and sky. Kings sponsored offerings, maintained canals, restored shrines, positioned themselves as guardians of cosmic stability. Even warfare was often framed not simply as conquest, but as the restoration of proper order. From a modern perspective, such beliefs may appear symbolic rather than literal, yet symbolism does not necessarily weaken the emotional truth inside the records. If ancient people believed civilization was fragile, surrounded constantly by flood, drought, darkness, and uncertainty, then the idea of sacred kingship may have offered reassurance that the world still possessed structure beneath its chaos. And perhaps that's why the old scribes preserved these traditions so carefully. The names of the kings were not only memories of rulers, they were reminders of a time when humanity believed heaven and earth stood closer together than they do now. Beyond the lists themselves, the cities of ancient Sumer still held temples reaching upward into the night, as though waiting for something to descend once more. Memory can be a burden, especially for a civilization that has watched rivers rise, cities fall, and rulers disappear into names no one living can fully explain. The Sumerian scribes did not preserve the king list only because they enjoyed old stories. They belonged to a world where continuity mattered. To remember the line of kings was to remember that order had once been given, carried, broken, and restored. Every ancient city lived with the knowledge that permanence was fragile. A canal could silt up, a harvest could fail, a temple could be damaged by war or flood. A dynasty that seemed eternal could vanish within a generation, leaving only broken bricks and a few signs pressed into clay. Against that uncertainty, lists became anchors. They gave shape to time. They told later people that they were not alone in the long movement of history. This is why the pre-flood kings occupy such a strange and powerful place. They stand at the edge of memory, before the waters, before the familiar world. Their names may not function like ordinary historical records, but they still carry emotional truth. They suggest that the Mesopotamians imagined civilization as something older than any single city, older than any one king, and perhaps older than the world they themselves inhabited in deepest time. There is a quiet sadness in this. To write down a name from an age already lost is to admit that forgetting has begun. The scribe cannot bring back the city as it was. He cannot hear the old language exactly as it sounded, or walk beneath the vanished roofs, or see the first temple lamps burning in the dark. But he can press a sign into clay, he can leave a trace, and sometimes a trace is enough. Thousands of years later, that same trace reaches us through museum glass, excavation reports, and fragments lifted from earth, the color of ash. It tells us that ancient people looked backward too. They wondered about beginnings, they feared endings, they asked what had been lost before them. To follow their memory further, we must now step beyond the written list and enter the sacred idea behind it. a world where kingship itself was believed to descend from heaven. In the old imagination of Sumer, kingship did not rise from the dust by human ambition alone. It came from above, from the bright and distant realm where the gods were believed to arrange the hidden order of the world. The phrase is simple, almost quiet. Kingship descended from heaven, yet inside it rests one of the deepest ideas in Mesopotamian thought. To say that kingship descended was to say that civilization itself had a sacred beginning. The city was not merely a cluster of houses beside a river. The temple was not only a building of brick. The ruler was not only a powerful man seated above others. All of these belonged to a pattern, a design that ancient people believed connected Earth to the unseen powers above it. This does not mean the records must be read as literal history in the modern sense. A careful reading leaves room for symbol, memory, and religious imagination. But symbols can preserve truths that dates alone cannot hold. The old scribes may have been describing the feeling that order entered human life from somewhere beyond ordinary survival. Before kingship, there is wilderness, scattered people, uncertain harvests, and fear of chaos. After kingship descends, there is measurement, ritual, irrigation, judgment, and the naming of cities. The world becomes arranged. Time begins to move through rulers, temples, festivals, and written records under the patient Mesopotamian sky. Perhaps this is why the first kings before the flood seem so distant, almost glowing at the edge of memory. They belong to a time when authority was imagined not only as control, but as custody. The king was meant to guard a balance already given by heaven, and if such a gift could descend, then it could also be lost. Beneath the calm words of the tablet is a fragile thought. Civilization is not guaranteed. It must be received, tended, remembered, and protected. To understand that sacred descent more fully, we have to look at the places where heaven and earth were believed to meet quietly. Across the plains of southern Mesopotamia, the temples of the ancient cities rose above the flat horizon, like artificial mountains built from mud brick and devotion. Long before stone monuments dominated other parts of the ancient world, the people of Sumer shaped enormous stepped structures that lifted priests, rituals, and sacred fires closer toward the sky. These were the ziggurats, and to many who stood below them, they may have felt like bridges between worlds. At ground level, daily life continued with ordinary rhythms. Merchants crossed narrow streets carrying grain and wool. Children moved through crowded courtyards. Water traveled through canals cut carefully into the earth. Yet above this movement stood the temple complex, elevated physically and spiritually from the city around it. The temple was more than a place of worship. It functioned as a center of memory, administration, astronomy, storage, ritual, and sacred authority. Offerings were collected there. Calendars were maintained there. Scribes copied records beneath its walls. The king himself often ruled in close connection with the temple, reinforcing the belief that order flowed downward from the heavens into human society. At night, oil lamps flickering along temple stairways must have created an unforgettable sight across the dark plain. One can imagine priests climbing slowly upward, while stars spread above the rivers of Mesopotamia. In such moments, the distance between heaven and earth may not have felt as vast as it does now. Ancient people did not divide the spiritual and material worlds as sharply as modern societies often do. A city existed inside both realms at once. Floods, droughts, eclipses, harvests, and victories all carried sacred meaning. The temple stood at the center of this understanding, holding together the visible and invisible patterns believed to shape existence. This atmosphere helps explain why the earliest records speak of kingship descending from heaven. The phrase emerged from a civilization where divine order was woven into architecture, ritual, and daily life itself. And in the oldest traditions, kings were not the only figures associated with sacred knowledge. Beyond the rulers and temples, there were also mysterious teachers remembered at the dawn of civilization. Figures who seemed to arrive carrying wisdom from another realm of memory. long before later cultures imagined wandering sages, prophets, or hidden teachers. The civilizations of Mesopotamia preserved stories about ancient beings connected to wisdom at the beginning of human order. In some traditions, they were remembered as the Apkallu, figures associated with sacred knowledge, ritual understanding, writing, and the shaping of civilization itself. The descriptions vary across different texts and periods. Some portray them as wise advisors serving the earliest kings. Others describe them with symbolic features that seem to place them between worlds, part human and part divine. In art from later Mesopotamian cultures, certain Apkallu figures appear cloaked in fish skins or carrying ritual objects, as though they belonged both to the rivers of earth and to deeper cosmic waters beyond ordinary life. For modern listeners, these traditions can easily invite exaggerated interpretations. Yet the quieter and perhaps more meaningful approach is to see them as expressions of how ancient people understood the arrival of knowledge itself. Agriculture, writing, astronomy, ritual, law, and city planning must once have felt almost miraculous compared to earlier human existence. Entire systems of order emerged within only a few generations. Perhaps the stories of divine teachers preserved the memory of that transformation. The Apkallu may have represented humanity's belief that civilization was not discovered casually, but received carefully, as though wisdom entered the world from somewhere beyond ordinary survival. This idea appears in many ancient cultures in different forms. There are culture bearers, lawgivers, wandering sages, and semi-divine instructors who bring structure to human life. Mesopotamia expressed this memory through its own sacred language, tying wisdom directly to the first cities and kings before the flood. What matters most is not whether such beings existed literally as later imagination described them. The deeper importance lies in what the stories reveal about the human mind. People sensed that civilization itself was fragile, difficult, and precious. Knowledge had to be preserved, repeated, guarded against forgetting, and perhaps that is why the earliest age was remembered with such reverence. The world before the flood was not only ancient, it was imagined as a time when wisdom stood closer to humanity than it does now. But even sacred order can weaken over time. Beneath the calm traditions of Sumer, there are hints that the first balance between heaven, earth, kingship, and memory would not last forever. In the oldest Mesopotamian traditions, a king was expected to be more than a ruler surrounded by soldiers and walls. He stood at the center of a delicate structure that held the city together. The rivers had to flow properly through the canals. The temples had to remain active with ritual and offering. Trade routes had to stay open. Crops had to survive the changing seasons. Justice had to exist strongly enough that ordinary people believed the world still possessed order beneath uncertainty. This responsibility gave kingship a sacred dimension. The ruler was not only protecting land or wealth, he was guarding balance itself. Ancient inscriptions often describe kings restoring temples, rebuilding canals, feeding the gods through offerings, and maintaining harmony between divine expectation and human society. Even warfare was sometimes presented not as simple conquest, but as the correction of disorder. Whether these claims reflected reality perfectly is another matter. Yet they reveal how kings wished to be understood within their own civilization. To modern eyes, such ideas may appear ceremonial or symbolic, but for people living in the vulnerable environment of Mesopotamia, where rivers could nourish or destroy entire populations, the fear of chaos was never far away. Floodwaters could erase fields overnight. Drought could hollow cities slowly from within. A failed harvest could threaten the survival of thousands. Against this background, the king became a stabilizing figure, someone meant to preserve continuity between the heavens above and the fragile settlements below. Perhaps this also explains the unusual emotional tones surrounding the pre-flood rulers. They are remembered less like ordinary political leaders and more like guardians of an older sacred order. Their reigns belong to a world imagined as closer to divine structure, before catastrophe interrupted the rhythm of civilization. And yet, beneath these traditions is a quiet sense of vulnerability. If kingship descended from heaven, it could also drift away from its original purpose. A city could lose balance. Ritual could weaken. Human beings could forget the order they once believed was given to them. The old records never describe this collapse in sudden, dramatic language. Instead, the feeling grows slowly beneath the stories, like dark water gathering beyond the horizon. The age before the flood begins to feel not only distant but fragile, suspended on the edge of something approaching through silence. Every civilization has a moment when its confidence begins to thin. The walls still stand, the temples still rise above the plain, the rivers still move through their channels. But somewhere inside the old order, a fracture begins quietly, before anyone can name it. The Sumerian records do not describe the pre-flood world as a simple age of darkness. They remember it as an age of kingship, cities, authority, and inherited wisdom. That is what makes the coming flood feel powerful. It does not interrupt emptiness. It interrupts a world arranged, a world with names, rulers, temples, and memory. In symbolic terms, this may be the deeper meaning of the story. The flood marks the moment when order becomes vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Water in Mesopotamia was never only gentle. It gave life through canals and rivers, but it could also rise without mercy, turning fields into mud and streets into silence. A people who lived between drought and flood would understand how quickly structure could dissolve. Perhaps the pre-flood kings were remembered as guardians of an order that could not finally protect itself. Their long reigns and sacred names may have expressed a longing for stability, for an age when heaven and earth still seemed joined by a visible thread. Yet even that thread, in the old memory, was not unbreakable. There is something human in this. We build cities as if they will remain. We write records as if someone will read them. We arrange our lives against the fear that time will scatter everything. The ancient scribes may have felt this too, pressing signs into clay while knowing that clay itself could be buried, broken, or forgotten. And so the first great movement of the story darkens gently. Kingship has descended, cities have risen, wisdom has been guarded. But beyond the edge of the known world, water waits. Before we reach the flood, however, we must pause over one of the strangest details in the records: the impossible spans of time assigned to kings themselves. The reigns of the earliest kings stretch across the tablets with numbers so vast that they seem to belong to another kind of reality. According to the Sumerian King List, some rulers governed for tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu is said to rule for 28,000 years. Others reign even longer, their lifespans unfolding across spans of time difficult for the modern mind to hold comfortably. At first encounter, such numbers can create distance between the reader and the text. Modern history is trained to measure time carefully through calendars, excavations, and layers of evidence. A human reign lasting thousands of years appears impossible almost immediately. Yet the ancient scribes preserved these numbers deliberately, copying them again across generations rather than correcting or removing them. One explanation is symbolic scale. In many ancient traditions, large numbers were not always intended as literal measurements in the modern sense. They could express sacred importance, cosmic authority, or the feeling that a figure belonged to a world larger than ordinary human life. The earliest kings may have been placed in a distant age where time itself was imagined differently. Another possibility is that the numbers reflected a deep separation between the world before the flood and the world that came afterward. The pre-flood age may have been remembered as a period standing outside normal historical time, closer to origins, divinity, and mythic memory. By assigning enormous reign lengths to those kings, the scribes marked them as belonging to a sacred horizon beyond everyday chronology. There is also a quieter emotional layer beneath the mathematics. Human beings often enlarge the distant past in memory. Ancient ancestors become greater, wiser, and more enduring than ordinary people living in the present. The farther a civilization looks backward, the more the earliest age can begin to feel immense and almost unreachable. And perhaps this is why the impossible numbers continue to fascinate listeners today. Even when interpreted symbolically, they suggest that the ancient world sensed a difference between the first stage of civilization and the later eras that followed it. The numbers do not need to function as literal proof in order to remain meaningful. They preserve an atmosphere, the feeling that humanity once stood closer to something vast, ordered, and difficult to recover fully now. To modern readers, numbers often feel cold and exact, tools used to measure distance, weight, and time with precision. But in many ancient cultures, numbers also carried symbolic meaning. They could express hierarchy, sacred balance, cosmic order, or spiritual importance in ways that modern arithmetic alone cannot fully explain. The people of Mesopotamia lived within a mathematical system already deeply connected to the movements of the heavens and the rhythms of ritual life. Their counting methods shaped how later civilizations would measure hours, circles, and calendars. Even today, traces of that ancient numerical world remain around us in the 60-minute hour and the division of the sky into degrees. Within such a culture, large numbers may not always have functioned simply as literal statistics. A king assigned an enormous reign could be understood as belonging to a sacred age, elevated beyond ordinary human limitation. The scale itself created distance between the present world and the remembered world before the flood. This does not mean the scribes were careless or irrational. Ancient symbolism often followed its own internal structure. Certain numbers repeated because they carried ceremonial or cosmic associations. Long reigns may have signaled stability, divine favor, or the feeling that the first rulers stood nearer to the origin of civilization itself. There is also a poetic quality to these immense spans of time. They slow the imagination. They make the earliest kings feel less like ordinary political figures and more like pillars, holding open the first chapter of human memory. The pre-flood world becomes difficult to place within ordinary chronology, because perhaps it was never intended to exist fully within ordinary time at all. Some scholars suggest that the exaggerated reigns could reflect compressed dynasties, symbolic calculations, or literary traditions passed through centuries of retelling. Others view the numbers primarily as mythic language expressing the sacred nature of beginnings. None of these interpretations erase the atmosphere created by the texts themselves. The tablets seem to whisper that the first age of humanity was larger, slower, and more distant than the world that followed after the floodwaters receded. Whether that distance belonged to literal time or symbolic imagination remains uncertain. Yet, uncertainty is part of what keeps these records alive. The ancient numbers resist easy interpretation, and in doing so, they continue drawing listeners deeper into the strange horizon, where myth, memory, and history begin to blur together. Scholars who study the Sumerian King List usually approach its earliest lines with caution. They do not treat the pre-flood reigns as ordinary historical records. In the same way, they might examine a dated inscription from a known king of Ur or Lagash. The numbers are too large, the setting too mythic, and the distance from recoverable history too great. One common reading is that the earliest kings represent a blend of memory, theology, and political imagination. Later rulers may have used ancient king lists to show that their own authority belonged to a chain reaching back into sacred beginnings. If kingship had descended from heaven, then every later king wanted to stand somewhere inside that heavenly order. The list gave shape to legitimacy. It made rule appear inherited from the first age of the world. Another interpretation is that some reigns may preserve distant echoes of dynasties rather than individual lifespans. A name could stand for a house, a city period, or a remembered tradition that became compressed into a single ruler. Over centuries, oral memory and scribal copying could turn complex histories into cleaner, more ceremonial sequences. This careful approach helps keep the mystery grounded. It reminds us that ancient records were not written for modern readers with modern categories. They were created inside temple cultures where politics, religion, memory, and cosmic order were woven together. A document could be historical in one layer, symbolic in another, and theological in another, all at the same time. Yet even the most grounded explanation does not make the records feel ordinary. If the numbers were symbolic, we still have to ask why these symbols mattered. If the names represented dynasties, we still have to ask why those dynasties were placed before the flood. If the list served royal legitimacy, we still have to ask why legitimacy had to reach so far backward, into a world almost beyond time. The scholarly lens does not close the doorway. It simply makes the doorway clearer. Behind the impossible stands a civilization trying to connect its present to an origin older than memory, older than kings anyone could verify, and perhaps older than history itself. And that origin still waits quietly behind the broken lines of clay tonight. Even after the theories, the calculations, and the careful interpretations, something unresolved continues to linger around the earliest kings of the Sumerian world. The mystery does not disappear simply because the numbers may be symbolic. In some ways, the symbolism deepens the atmosphere rather than reducing it. The ancient scribes could have begun their history with ordinary rulers whose reigns resembled the lifespans of later kings. Instead, they opened with figures placed at an immense distance from the present world, rulers who seemed to belong to another rhythm of existence entirely. The effect is almost dreamlike. The first age stretches outward beyond familiar scale, standing at the edge of memory where history begins dissolving into sacred imagination. Perhaps this is what the records were always meant to preserve. Not factual chronology in the modern sense, but emotional distance. The pre-flood world feels larger because it represents origins. Human beings across many cultures often imagine beginnings as more powerful, more ordered, and closer to divine structure than the eras that follow afterward. The first mountain, the first temple, the first ancestors, the first kings. Origins gather gravity inside the imagination. There is also another possibility, quieter and more difficult to define. Ancient civilizations may have sensed that memory itself changes as it reaches farther into the past. Events become symbols, symbols become myths, yet myths can still carry traces of real human fears and experiences hidden beneath their surface. A flood remembered across generations may slowly transform into sacred narrative without losing the emotional truth of catastrophe. The same may be true of the kings. Whether they were historical rulers, dynastic memories, symbolic figures, or a blend of all three, they reveal a civilization deeply concerned with continuity. The Sumerians did not imagine humanity beginning in emptiness. They imagined themselves inheriting the remains of an older order whose full meaning had already faded. And perhaps that feeling still reaches us now because it mirrors something modern people quietly feel as well. We live surrounded by records, ruins, and fragments of earlier worlds, always aware that much has already been lost. To understand those forgotten beginnings more fully, we must leave the strange mathematics of sacred time and walk into the cities themselves, the places where the first kings were said to rule before the floodwaters came. Long before later empires gave Mesopotamia its familiar names, the city of Eridu stood near the southern marshes like a quiet threshold between land, water, and sky. In Sumerian memory, Eridu was not simply old, it was first. It was the place where kingship descended after heaven opened its invisible hand toward the human world. The landscape around Eridu must have felt very different from the dry ruins seen today. In the deep past, waterways, reed beds, marsh winds, and open horizons shaped the edge of settlement. People lived close to the breathing of water. Fish, birds, mud brick, boats, and temple smoke belonged to the same world. Out of this low, wet land, a sacred city rose. At its heart stood the temple tradition connected with Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, hidden knowledge, and creative order. This association matters because Eridu was remembered not only as a political beginning, but as a spiritual one. Civilization began there. It began beside deep waters, under the care of a deity linked with intelligence, craft, and the mysterious life beneath the earth. Archaeology shows that Eridu contained some of the earliest temple levels in southern Mesopotamia, rebuilt again and again over long periods. Each rebuilding placed a new sacred layer above an older one, as if the city itself were remembering its own beginning through architecture. A shrine became a larger shrine. A platform became a temple mound. Devotion accumulated like sediment. For the story of the pre-flood kings, Eridu carries a special stillness. It is where the first name, Alulim, is placed. Whether that name represents a ruler, a symbol, or a memory older than clear history, the setting gives it weight. Eridu feels like a doorway, not only into Sumer, but into the idea that civilization began beside sacred waters, with wisdom rising quietly from the deep. From that first threshold, the records begin to move onward, carrying kingship from one ancient city to another, as if sacred order were traveling across the plain beneath the open heavens. After Eridu, the ancient records continue their slow procession across the plains of Mesopotamia, carrying kingship from one city to another, as though authority itself moved like a river through the land. Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. The names arrive quietly on the tablets, but together they create the outline of a world remembered as older than the flood. Each city carried its own atmosphere and sacred identity. Bad Tibira was associated in later traditions with metalworking and divine craftsmanship, a place where human skill transformed earth into tools, weapons, and ritual objects. Sippar became linked with the sun god Shamash, whose light represented justice, truth, and cosmic order. Shuruppak, resting closer to the coming flood tradition, would eventually stand near the edge of survival itself. What is striking is the careful movement of kingship between these places. The King List does not present civilization as scattered or random. It unfolds in sequence, almost ceremonially, as if the ancient scribes wished to preserve the idea that sacred order passed deliberately from city to city across time. Archaeology cannot confirm every detail preserved in these traditions, yet the cities themselves were real. Their ruins remain beneath layers of dust and salt across modern Iraq, broken into mounds that still rise from the plain. In some places, fragments of walls, pottery, or temple foundations continue sleeping beneath the earth, holding traces of lives lived thousands of years ago beside shifting rivers. For listeners tonight, these cities can feel both distant and strangely familiar. Human beings gathered there to build homes, light fires, raise children, store grain, worship their gods, and ask questions about survival beneath uncertain skies. The flood stories and sacred kings came later through memory, but the cities themselves once breathed with ordinary life. Perhaps this is why the traditions endure emotionally, even when their oldest layers resist certainty. The records preserve more than myth. They preserve the feeling that civilization moved carefully through vulnerable places, always dependent on water, order, memory, and cooperation. And among all those ancient cities, one name begins to darken gently with approaching significance: Shuruppak. In later traditions, it would become tied forever to warnings, survival, and the rising waters that separated the first age of humanity from the world that followed after it. Shuruppak stands in the old traditions like a city listening for distant water. By the time its name appears near the end of the pre-flood sequence, the story has already traveled through sacred beginnings, long reigns, and cities where kingship was believed to rest for ages. But Shuruppak carries a different atmosphere. It feels closer to the edge. In Mesopotamian memory, Shuruppak became associated with the flood survivor known in Sumerian tradition as Ziusudra, and in later related traditions by other names and forms. He is the figure who receives warning, preserves life, and passes through catastrophe into another world. Because of that connection, Shuruppak is not only a city in a list. It becomes the place where history begins to hold its breath. Imagine it not as a symbol first, but as a living settlement. Mud brick houses standing close together, boats tied along channels, grain stored against uncertain seasons. Families moving through narrow ways at dusk, while temple rituals continue above them. No one living there would have known they were becoming part of a memory that later generations would read as the final stillness before destruction. The power of Shuruppak comes from this nearness. It belongs to the pre-flood world, yet it also points beyond it. It is both ordinary and sacred, both a human city and a threshold. In that tension, the flood story begins to feel less like a sudden myth and more like a deep memory of vulnerability. Scholars may read these traditions as layered literature, shaped by generations of scribes, theology, and older flood experiences in the riverlands. That careful view matters. But even through that lens, Shuruppak remains haunting. It shows how a place can become more than geography. A city can become a warning. A name can become a shoreline between two ages. From here, the idea of the pre-flood world begins to change. It is no longer only ancient. It is fragile, waiting beneath a sky that may already be gathering clouds. Somewhere, the rivers are beginning to rise. When modern people hear the phrase lost civilization, the imagination often moves immediately toward vanished technologies, hidden machines, or dramatic visions of forgotten empires buried beneath oceans and desert sands. But the ancient world may have understood advancement differently. The pre-flood civilization, remembered by Mesopotamian tradition, does not need to resemble a modern industrial society in order to feel profound. Its greatness may have rested instead in order, symbolism, memory, and the ability to shape human life into something stable beside dangerous rivers and uncertain skies. To create cities in southern Mesopotamia required extraordinary coordination. Canals had to be maintained carefully. Water needed to be directed across dry land at the correct times of year. Crops depended on planning, labor, and cooperation across entire communities. Writing systems emerged. Temple calendars tracked ritual and season. Law, trade, architecture, and administration slowly formed the framework of civilization. For the people living there, this transformation must have felt immense. Perhaps this is why later traditions remembered the earliest age with such reverence. The world before the flood may have represented a time when humanity believed itself closer to sacred wisdom, closer to the original ordering of life. Advancement, in this sense, was not measured through machines, but through harmony between city, ritual, agriculture, memory, and the divine structure thought to surround existence. The stories of divine teachers and heavenly kingship fit naturally into this atmosphere. Civilization itself appeared almost miraculous. Human beings had crossed from scattered survival into organized society. Temples rose above the plains, written records preserved thought beyond a single lifetime. Names endured after death, and yet all of it remained fragile. A flood could undo years of labor within days. Salts could poison fields slowly over generations. Rivers could abandon old channels. War could scatter people who once believed their city stood at the center of the world. This fragility may explain why the old records feel both proud and mournful at the same time. The scribes remembered an age of greatness, but they also remembered that greatness disappearing beneath water and time. As the story approaches the flood's self, the atmosphere begins to slow. The cities still stand. The temples still burn with light at night. But somewhere beyond the horizon, the silence before catastrophe is already beginning to gather across the plain. Before the flood arrives in the stories, there is a moment worth imagining. Not because the records describe it in detail, but because every vanished city seems to contain such a pause. The streets remain open. The river still reflects the evening sky. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Someone carries grain through a doorway. Someone seals a jar for storage. Someone listens to insects in the reeds and thinks only of tomorrow. This is the stillness before the flood, and it belongs as much to feeling as to history. In Shuruppak, or in any city remembered at the edge of catastrophe, life would have continued with ordinary tenderness. Children would have slept beside mud brick walls. Workers would have returned from canals with tired hands. Priests would have kept rituals moving according to calendars older than themselves. The temple lamps would have glowed in the dark, small lights against an enormous sky. No one inside such a moment can fully know what later generations will make of it. A city that feels permanent to its people may become, centuries later, only a name on a broken tablet. A street crossed casually at dusk may become part of a buried layer. A voice calling from one roof to another may vanish so completely that only silence remains above it. This is why the pre-flood world carries such a haunting softness. It is not only mysterious because it is old, it is mysterious because it was once alive. Whatever symbolic meanings the later texts gave to those kings and cities, they rested upon the deeper human truth that civilizations are lived from the inside, one quiet day at a time. And so, before the waters enter the story, we can let the scene become still. The rivers move in their beds, the stars appear over the plain. The ancient cities breathe beneath the night, unaware that memory is about to divide the world into before and after. Soon the records will speak of floodwaters, survivors, warnings, and the line between two ages. In the ancient records of Mesopotamia, the flood is more than a disaster. It is a dividing line between worlds. Everything before it belongs to a distant age of sacred kingship and immense spans of time. Everything after it moves closer to the familiar rhythms of ordinary human history. The waters do not simply destroy cities, they separate memory itself. This structure appears clearly in the Sumerian King List. After the long reigns of the earliest kings, the text pauses around the flood, as though history has been broken into two chapters. Kingship existed before the waters, then the flood came. Afterward, kingship descended once again, beginning a new sequence of rulers and cities beneath altered conditions. Such a division carries symbolic power. Floodwaters erase boundaries, roads, homes, and landmarks. They blur distinctions between one field and another, until the landscape becomes almost unrecognizable. In the same way, the Mesopotamian flood seems to wash away the certainty of the First Age. The immense rains shrink, the sacred distance narrows. Human history begins to feel smaller and more fragile afterward. This does not mean the story must describe a single worldwide catastrophe exactly as later imagination sometimes presents it. Ancient flood traditions likely drew from many experiences familiar to river civilizations. In Mesopotamia especially, water could arrive with terrifying force. Entire settlements could be damaged or abandoned after severe flooding. Over generations, those experiences may have deepened into sacred memory. Yet the flood in these traditions becomes larger than weather alone. It represents interruption. A world once believed stable is suddenly revealed as vulnerable. The sacred order guarded by kings, temples, and rituals cannot fully resist the forces gathering beyond human control. Perhaps that is why flood stories appear so often across cultures. Water becomes the symbol of impermanence itself. No wall lasts forever, no dynasty remains untouched by time. Even the oldest cities eventually sink beneath mud and silence. And still, within the Mesopotamian imagination, something survives. The flood destroys, but it does not erase memory completely. Names continue, stories continue. A few figures carry fragments of the old world forward into the uncertain age that follows after the waters recede. Among the oldest flood traditions preserved in Mesopotamia, the figure of Ziusudra stands quietly at the center of survival. His name appears through damaged fragments and later retellings, emerging from the ancient world like someone half-remembered through water and mist. He is not presented as a conqueror or warrior. Instead, he becomes the one who listens, prepares, and endures. According to the Sumerian tradition, Ziusudra receives warning of the coming flood before the waters arrive. The details vary depending on the surviving text, and many portions remain incomplete after thousands of years underground. Yet the emotional shape of the story remains recognizable. A catastrophe approaches. One figure is chosen to preserve life through it. The world before the flood begins slipping away. What makes these ancient flood survivors compelling is their humanity. Later traditions often surround them with sacred meaning, but beneath that symbolism is a familiar fear. How does a person continue when the known world collapses? What is worth saving when everything else may vanish? For the Mesopotamians, survival was never only physical. Memory also had to survive. Rituals, names, skills, stories, and the structure of civilization itself needed to cross through destruction into the age that followed. In this sense, Ziusudra becomes more than an individual. He represents continuity carried across catastrophe, like a small flame protected from wind. The flood itself remains difficult to define historically. Ancient records preserve spiritual and literary dimensions, alongside possible memories of real disasters in the riverlands. The story does not function like a modern eyewitness report. It moves instead through sacred imagination, where survival carries moral and cosmic significance, as well as physical meaning. Still, there is something deeply calming in the image of preservation against overwhelming water. A single vessel moving through darkness. A survivor holding on to fragments of the old world while everything familiar disappears beneath rain and flood. Perhaps this is why such stories endured for thousands of years. They speak not only to fear but to endurance. Civilizations may fall, cities may sink into mud, yet memory continues moving forward through fragile human hands. And as the traditions evolved through later centuries, another flood figure emerged beside Ziusudra, carrying the story deeper into Mesopotamian imagination. Atrahasis, the wise survivor who listened carefully before the waters came. In the Akkadian tradition, the survivor of the flood is often remembered as Atrahasis, a name usually understood as meaning the exceedingly wise. His story carries the same deep movement as the older Sumerian memory, yet it adds another layer of meaning. Here, the flood is not only an event that breaks the world, it grows from tension between humanity and the divine realm. In the Atrahasis epic, human beings are created to relieve the gods of labor. They work, build, multiply, and fill the land with sound. Over time, their noise becomes unbearable to the higher powers. The detail may seem strange at first, but it is rich with symbolism. Noise can mean disorder. It can mean uncontrolled growth. It can mean that creation has become too crowded, too restless, too far from its original balance. The gods respond with hardship, famine, and finally flood. Yet within this severity, one divine figure warns Atrahasis, allowing him to prepare a vessel and preserve life. The story moves between judgment and mercy, destruction and continuation, silence and memory. For a sleep listener, the emotional center of this tale is not punishment. It is imbalance. The ancient world imagined existence as a fragile relationship between heaven, earth, humans, gods, rivers, animals, seasons. When that relationship became strained, catastrophe entered the story like water finding a crack in a wall. Modern scholars often read Atrahasis as mythic literature shaped by Mesopotamian concerns about labor, population, divine authority, and human vulnerability. It does not need to be treated as a literal report to remain powerful. It reflects a civilization asking why suffering comes, why life is unstable, and why survival sometimes depends on wisdom before strength. Atrahasis survives because he listens. That simple idea carries a quiet spiritual beauty. In a world filling with noise, the wise hears the warning hidden beneath it, and so the flood becomes more than water. It becomes a symbol of what happens when order is forgotten, when balance fails, and when only a fragile thread of memory is carried forward into the next age through darkness, rain, and the long silence after the storm finally passed. Centuries after the earliest Sumerian flood traditions were first pressed into clay, another flood story would emerge in the Hebrew Bible, carrying familiar shapes into a new spiritual landscape. The figure of Noah, preserving life through rising waters, stands within a narrative deeply meaningful to later religious history. Yet many scholars have long noticed that parts of this story echo much older Mesopotamian traditions. The similarities are difficult to ignore completely. A divine warning is given before catastrophe arrives. A chosen survivor prepares a vessel. Animals and life are preserved. The flood reshapes the world. Afterward, humanity begins again beneath altered conditions. These patterns appear in the stories of Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and later in the Epic of Gilgamesh through the figure of Utnapishtim. This does not mean the biblical account is merely copied from earlier texts. Traditions evolve as they pass through different peoples, languages, and spiritual understandings. Stories absorb local meaning while preserving older structures beneath the surface. Over centuries, flood memory became part of many civilizations, each interpreting it through its own relationship with morality, survival, divine authority, and human fragility. What matters most here is not competition between traditions, but continuity. The ancient Near East was a connected world of trade routes, migrations, empires, and shared cultural memory. Ideas traveled across rivers and deserts just as goods and languages did. Flood stories likely moved through generations in similar ways, reshaped each time they were told beside new fires and under different skies. There is also something profoundly human about the persistence of these stories. Again and again, civilizations imagined a world interrupted by water, followed by survival, rebuilding, and remembrance. The flood became a symbol large enough to carry fear, judgment, cleansing, grief, and renewal all at once. For night listeners today, these parallels create a strange feeling of depth. Beneath later religious traditions, older voices still whisper from Mesopotamian clay tablets buried thousands of years ago beneath dust and river mud. And perhaps this is why the flood continues to endure within human imagination. It speaks not only about destruction, but about the fragile continuity of life itself. Even after waters erase the familiar world, something survives quietly enough to begin again. In many ancient traditions, water carries two meanings at once. It gives life, and it takes life away. Rivers nourish fields, sustain cities, and connect distant communities through trade and movement. Yet the same waters can rise beyond control, erasing boundaries in a matter of hours. For the civilizations of Mesopotamia, this dual nature of water shaped both daily existence and spiritual imagination. The flood traditions seem to emerge from this deep relationship. Water becomes more than weather or geography. It becomes a force of transformation. The old world disappears beneath it, and afterward the survivors step into a reality that feels altered, smaller, and more uncertain than before. Symbolically, floodwaters often represent erasure. Streets vanish, names disappear, temples sink beneath mud, human achievements lose their permanence. But the waters also carry another meaning, one quieter and more difficult to define. They clear space for renewal. They wash away structures that can no longer hold together. They return the world, briefly, to something close to beginning again. This may explain why so many flood stories end not only with grief, but with continuity. Seeds are preserved, animals survive, families continue. Memory crosses through catastrophe, even if damaged and incomplete. The world after the flood is not identical to the world before it, yet life moves forward beneath a changed sky. There is a calming sadness in this cycle. Human beings build civilizations believing they will last, but ancient stories remind us that permanence is fragile. Rivers shift, cities fade, records break apart. And still, generation after generation, people begin again. Perhaps this is why the flood remained such a powerful symbol in Mesopotamian thought. It reflected the emotional reality of life beside unpredictable waters, while also expressing something larger about existence itself. Everything visible can be swept away. Yet memory, meaning, and the desire to continue somehow survive beneath the surface. As the floodwaters recede from the ancient imagination, silence settles across the old world. The temples are gone from sight. The streets no longer echo with footsteps. Beneath mud and dark water, the first age of kings begins sinking slowly into memory. After the flood, the world in the old stories does not become loud again all at once. It wakes slowly, if it wakes at all. The waters begin to draw back from the fields, leaving behind mud, reeds bent flat, broken timber, and a silence so wide it seems to cover the horizon. Imagine standing there in the first pale light after the storm has passed. The sky is washed clean, but the earth below it feels unfamiliar. Paths that once led between houses have vanished. Courtyards have filled with silt. The edges of canals are blurred. Nothing holds its former shape with certainty. A world that had been measured by streets, thresholds, walls, and temple steps has become soft and undecided beneath receding water. This is the morning after catastrophe. But in a sleep story, it does not need to be harsh. It can be approached gently, as the ancient texts themselves often approach deep loss through symbol. The flood has done what floodwaters do. It has covered, erased, loosened and carried away. Yet somewhere within the stillness, survival remains. Perhaps a bird returns first. Perhaps a small piece of wood drifts against a bank. Perhaps a human voice, quiet and uncertain, speaks into the open air and hears no answer except the river moving slowly back into its bed. Such images remind us that ancient flood stories were not only about destruction. They were also about the fragile feeling of continuing after the world has changed. For those who listened to these stories in later generations, the aftermath may have mattered as much as the flood itself. Anyone can fear the rising waters, but what happens afterward is more mysterious. How does memory begin again when the old places have been altered? How does a people rebuild meaning when the familiar world has become a landscape of mud and silence? In this quiet after the storm, the first age does not vanish completely. It settles downward, beneath silt, beneath watermarks, beneath the soft ground where broken records and forgotten rooms may wait for another age to find them. When archaeologists excavate the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, they often move through layers of earth that resemble compressed time itself. One layer may contain the remains of homes, another traces of fire, another fragments of pottery, and another thick deposits of mud left behind by water long ago. Beneath each level rests the possibility that an earlier world once stood there quietly before being covered and forgotten. This is part of what gives the buried records their emotional power. They were not preserved inside perfect stone vaults untouched by history. Many survived because they fell into darkness accidentally. A collapsed wall protected them. A flood buried them beneath silt. A ruined archive sealed them away from sunlight and human hands. In some ancient sites, excavators uncovered tablets stacked in rooms where scribes once worked, still arranged in partial order after thousands of years underground. Elsewhere, only scattered fragments remained, broken corners carrying pieces of names and half-remembered lines. The earth had preserved some memories while erasing others. There is something deeply moving in this uneven survival. Entire lives disappear, yet a single inscription remains. A king's palace crumbles, but one clay tablet survives beneath the debris. Human history begins to resemble a shoreline after water retreats, where only scattered objects remain visible above the sand. The flood traditions of Mesopotamia seem to understand this feeling instinctively. Water becomes not only a destroyer but a keeper of silence. It buries things, it hides them. It leaves traces for future generations to uncover slowly and imperfectly. Perhaps this is why ancient ruins affect people so strongly even today. To stand beside a mound in Iraq beneath the evening sky is to stand above entire forgotten worlds layered beneath the ground. Somewhere below may rest rooms no one has entered for 4,000 years. Somewhere below may still lie tablets carrying names copied by hands that vanished before most later civilizations even began. The buried records remind us that history survives unevenly. What we know about the ancient world is only a small island rising above enormous depths of lost memory. And beyond the surviving tablets, another form of preservation continued moving quietly through human civilization after every collapse. The stories people carried within themselves. Long before many ancient traditions were written down, they survived through human voices. A story told beside a fire could travel farther than a caravan. A warning repeated from parent to child could cross centuries without ever touching clay or stone. Even after writing emerged in Mesopotamia, oral memory continued shaping how people understood the past. This matters when thinking about flood stories and the kings who ruled before them. Ancient did not appear in isolation. Behind every tablet likely stood generations of spoken tradition, fragments remembered imperfectly, repeated ceremonially, and reshaped over time by the fears and hopes of those preserving them. Human memory does not function like an archive. It changes as it moves. Details fade while emotions remain sharp. A local flood may grow into a cosmic flood across centuries of retelling. A respected ruler may become larger than life after generations speak his name with reverence. A city destroyed by water may slowly transform into the symbolic ending of an entire age. Yet this transformation does not make such stories meaningless. In some ways, it makes them more revealing. Myths often preserve emotional truths even when precise historical details disappear. They tell us what ancient people feared losing. They reveal what civilizations considered sacred enough to remember. For the Mesopotamians, continuity mattered deeply. The movement from chaos into order, from flood into survival, from forgotten kings into restored civilization, reflected anxieties familiar to anyone living beside dangerous rivers and unstable political worlds. The stories carried reassurance that even after catastrophe, memory itself could endure. There is also comfort in imagining how these tales traveled through ordinary lives. A father speaking quietly beneath the night sky. A temple singer reciting old lines during ritual. A scribe listening to traditions older than his own city before pressing them carefully into clay. The stories survived because people kept carrying them forward, even when the original world behind them had already vanished. And perhaps that is still happening now. Tonight, across thousands of years, the same ancient questions continue moving from voice to voice. What existed before the flood? What was lost? What remained? As those questions drift through the darkness, the names of the old kings begin to fade gently once more, like distant stars disappearing into the wide silence before dawn. You do not need to hold every city in your mind now. The rivers can grow quiet for a while. The kings may drift back into the darkness from which they first emerged. Alulim, Eridu, Shuruppak, Sudra. The names have traveled a very long distance to reach this moment, and it is enough simply to let them pass softly through the night. Above the ancient floodplains, the stars would have looked much as they do now. Sumerian priests once watched same patterns from temple stairways while river winds moved across the plain below. Somewhere in the distance, water touched reeds in darkness. Somewhere behind mud brick walls, scribes copied names already ancient to them. And somewhere beneath the earth, tablets began their long sleep beneath layers of dust and silence. The world of the first kings has faded almost completely from direct memory. The cities collapsed. The canals dried or shifted. Dynasties disappeared into fragments and uncertain translations. Yet something remained alive beneath the ruins. Not certainty, perhaps, but atmosphere. A feeling that human civilization once stood closer to origins than it does now. There is peace in allowing mysteries to remain partially unresolved. The old records do not demand perfect belief or perfect explanation. They simply invite attention. They remind us that history is not only made of confirmed dates and surviving monuments. It is also shaped by memory, imagination, fear, reverence, and the stories people refuse to abandon completely. And perhaps that is why the buried kings continue to matter. They stand at the edge between myth and remembrance, guarding the doorway to a world ancient people believed existed before the floodwaters changed everything. As the night deepens, the names can fade again like distant constellations over a sleeping desert. The rivers continue their slow movement through the dark. Wind passes across abandoned mounds where forgotten rooms still rest underground. Somewhere beneath the earth, the clay tablets remain patient in their silence, waiting for another generation to uncover them and wonder once more what humanity may have forgotten before recorded history truly began. As the silence settles over the buried cities, the story begins to widen beyond Mesopotamia alone. The floodwaters recede from the plains of Sumer, but their memory does not remain trapped there. Across distant cultures separated by mountains, deserts, and oceans, other civilizations also preserved stories about vanished ages, divine rulers, sacred order, and worlds interrupted by catastrophe. The details change from place to place. The names become unfamiliar. Different gods appear beneath different skies. Yet certain patterns return with surprising persistence. A great flood, a chosen survivor. An earlier age remembered as larger or more sacred than the present one. Wisdom carried through destruction into a new beginning. In Egypt, ancient kingship also carried divine meaning. Pharaohs were not viewed merely as political rulers, but as guardians of cosmic balance, preserving harmony between heaven and earth. In Greece, stories emerged about earlier ages of humanity and floods that reset civilization. In India, traditions told of Manu surviving a world-consuming flood with guidance from a mysterious being linked to sacred preservation. Far from Mesopotamia, flood memories surfaced again and again, like fragments carried by water into distant lands. This does not necessarily mean all civilizations remembered the same literal event. Human beings everywhere have lived beside dangerous rivers and changing seas. Flooding is part of the natural experience of settlement itself. Yet the emotional similarity of these stories remains striking. Again and again, humanity imagines a fragile world interrupted, cleansed, or transformed by overwhelming water. Perhaps the deeper connection lies not in geology alone, but in psychology and memory. Floods become symbols large enough to carry collective fears about collapse, forgetting, and survival. They express the understanding that civilizations are temporary, no matter how permanent they may appear while standing at their height. For the people of Mesopotamia, this realization lived close to daily life. Rivers nourished cities, but those same waters could erase years of labor within days. The flood, therefore, became both historical possibility and spiritual metaphor, a reminder that order must always exist beside uncertainty. And so the buried records of the first kings do not stand alone. They belong to a much larger human pattern, one stretching across continents and centuries, where civilizations looked backward into darkness and sensed that something older, deeper, and partially forgotten waited there still. In ancient Egypt, the idea of sacred kingship carried an atmosphere both familiar and distinct from the traditions of Mesopotamia. Along the Nile, order was not simply political, it was cosmic. The Egyptians used the concept of Ma'at to describe harmony, balance, truth, and the proper arrangement of existence itself. The pharaoh stood at the center of that order, responsible for maintaining stability between the divine realm, the natural world, and human society. Like the kings of ancient Sumer, Egyptian rulers were connected to heaven as much as earth. Temples aligned carefully with celestial events. Rituals followed sacred calendars. The flooding of the Nile was understood not merely as a physical process, but as part of a larger divine rhythm sustaining civilization year after year. There are differences, of course. Egyptian traditions did not preserve a pre-flood king list in the same exact form as Mesopotamia. Yet they also imagined remote ages when gods and semi-divine rulers governed the world before ordinary dynasties began. Some king lists and sacred traditions place divine beings at the beginning of history, creating a bridge between mythic time and human rule. This pattern is important because it suggests that ancient civilizations often viewed origins differently than modern historical thinking does. The earliest age was not imagined as primitive and empty. Instead, it was frequently remembered as sacred, ordered, and closer to divine presence than later periods. The Nile itself shaped this worldview deeply. Unlike the violent unpredictability of Mesopotamian rivers, the Nile flooded with more regularity, creating an atmosphere of renewal and continuity. Yet even within this stability, Egyptian civilization understood fragility. Tombs, temples, and inscriptions were all attempts to preserve identity against the erasing force of time. There is something deeply human in this shared impulse. Across different lands, people built monuments, copied names, and aligned sacred spaces beneath the stars because they feared disappearance. They wanted memory to outlive the body, the city, and even the kingdom itself. And perhaps that is why the old traditions continue speaking softly across cultures. Whether beside the Nile or the rivers of Sumer, humanity kept returning to the same quiet question. How can order survive in a world where everything eventually fades? The biblical memory of the world before Noah carries a different tone, but it touches many of the same deep places. In Genesis, the flood does not appear after a list of Sumerian kings with impossible reigns. It emerges inside a moral and spiritual drama, where human violence and corruption disturb the created order, and the waters become both judgment and beginning again. Yet beneath the difference in language, familiar patterns remain. There is an old world before the flood. There are generations whose lives stretch across unusually long spans of time. There is a chosen survivor who listens, prepares, and carries life through catastrophe. There is a vessel, a covering of waters, and a renewed world waiting on the other side. For many listeners, the biblical story is the most familiar doorway into flood memory. But when placed beside Mesopotamian traditions, it begins to feel part of a wider ancient conversation. The stories of Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, and Noah are not identical. Each belongs to its own religious world. Still, they seem to circle around the same human anxiety, that history can be broken, and that survival depends on preserving something sacred through the break. The pre-flood world in the Bible also feels spiritually different from the world after it. It is an age of long lives, strange unions, growing disorder, and divine sorrow. Later readers have often connected this atmosphere with ideas of watchers, giants, and forbidden knowledge, though interpretations vary widely. What matters for this journey is the feeling of an earlier humanity standing near mysteries that later generations could no longer fully explain. This gives the biblical parallel its quiet power. It does not need to be forced into the Sumerian record, nor separated from it completely. It can be heard as another echo from the ancient Near East, another attempt to describe a world before waters erased its shape almost from living memory. And after Noah, as after Ziusudra, humanity begins again beneath a sky that remembers the storm and keeps its silence above them. The ancient Greeks also imagined humanity living through earlier ages that stood apart from the ordinary world. Their stories spoke of golden ages, silver ages, bronze ages, and times of decline that unfolded slowly across vast stretches of mythic memory. These were not historical timelines in the modern sense. They were emotional maps of how civilizations understood distance from their own beginnings. In one Greek flood tradition, the world is destroyed during the age of Deucalion. Zeus sends overwhelming waters after humanity falls into corruption and disorder. Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha, survive by sheltering inside a vessel until the flood recedes and the world can begin again. The details differ from the Mesopotamian stories, yet the emotional structure feels familiar: a broken world, divine dissatisfaction, floodwaters covering civilization, a small remnant surviving to restore humanity afterward. Greek mythology also carried a deep awareness of decline over time. Hesiod described earlier ages of humanity as stronger, nobler, or closer to divine order than the present age of struggle and uncertainty. This idea appears across many cultures. The distant past becomes spiritually enlarged, while later humanity feels separated from origins by loss, forgetting, and moral weakening. Perhaps these stories reflect something universal in human imagination. People often look backward toward beginnings with longing. The first kings, first ancestors, and first cities become symbolic mirrors for what later generations feel they have lost. At the same time, the Greek flood stories remind us that ancient cultures rarely separated myth, morality, and memory into isolated categories. Floods could describe natural catastrophe, divine judgment, symbolic cleansing, and social collapse all at once. The meaning lived inside the layering. For listeners tonight, the important thread is not whether every tradition refers to the same literal event. The deeper pattern is the persistence of the flood itself as a symbol of interruption. Again and again, civilizations imagined a boundary between an older sacred world and the uncertain age that followed after waters passed through history. And far beyond Greece and Mesopotamia, even more distant cultures carried their own memories of great floods, vanished worlds, and fragile survival beneath changing skies. Far from the river plains of Mesopotamia and the temples of Egypt, other civilizations also carried memories of overwhelming water. Their stories arose under different skies, in different languages, shaped by different landscapes and sacred imaginations. Yet again and again the same image returns, a world covered, a remnant preserved, and life beginning again after loss. In India, later traditions remember Manu, warned of a coming flood by a mysterious fish who grows in size and reveals divine significance. Manu preserves life through the waters and becomes connected with renewal after catastrophe. In parts of Mesoamerica, flood traditions also appear, often tied to earlier worlds, destroyed ages, or cycles of creation and renewal. Across the Pacific, across mountain regions, across coastlands and river valleys, communities preserved stories of waters that changed everything. These parallels should be approached with care. They do not prove a single global memory in a simple way. Cultures everywhere have lived near rivers, seas, storms, and coastlines. Flooding is one of humanity's oldest environmental fears. It is natural that many peoples would turn water into sacred storytelling. Yet the repetition still matters. Flood stories are rarely only about water. They are about the vulnerability of human order. They ask what survives when homes disappear, when landmarks vanish, when familiar ground is no longer trustworthy. They turn disaster into meaning, and meaning into memory. Perhaps every civilization, in its own way, senses that the world beneath its feet is less permanent than it appears. A city may stand for centuries and still become a mound. A temple may rise above crowds and still fall into silence. A name may be spoken with reverence and later survive only as a broken sound in an old inscription. The distant flood stories remind us that the Mesopotamian records are part of a wider human pattern. Whether carried by clay tablets, chants, sacred books, or fireside retellings, these memories gather around the same quiet fear and hope, that something can end, and yet something can continue. Beneath the different names and landscapes, there seems to be a pattern waiting inside the stories, one that asks why humanity so often remembers itself as living after a world already lost. When flood stories are placed beside one another, they begin to feel less like isolated legends and more like reflections in scattered pieces of dark water. Each culture gives the memory its own language. Each landscape shapes the form of the catastrophe. Yet beneath the different names, there is a shared human recognition. The world can change faster than memory is able to protect it. This pattern may be one reason such stories endure. They speak to people who know, somewhere inside themselves, that civilization is fragile. Houses, roads, temples, archives, and kingdoms can all appear solid while they stand. but time is always moving beneath them. Rivers shift, fires burn, empires break apart. Sand covers what stone cannot save. Water enters the lowest rooms first, then slowly rewrites the map. Ancient flood stories transform that fear into meaning. They do not leave catastrophe as emptiness, they give it shape. A warning is heard, a vessel is prepared, a remnant survives. A new world begins, carrying scars from the old one. Through this structure, human beings found a way to imagine continuity after rupture. Perhaps this is why the buried kings of Sumer still feel connected to distant myths around the world. They belong to the same emotional landscape, the memory of an earlier order, the loss of that order, and the strange hope that something precious can cross through destruction. In this sense, myth is not the enemy of history. It is one of the ways people carry what history cannot fully preserve. Dates may vanish, names may fracture, the exact shape of an event may be lost, but the feeling remains, passed from voice to voice, until it becomes a story large enough to hold generations. And so the pattern beneath the flood stories is not only water, it is longing, it is grief, it is survival. It is the quiet belief that before our remembered world there may have been another, half buried in earth, half preserved in the dreaming memory of humankind, still softly waiting there. The ancient kings of Sumer may never be fully understood as modern historical figures. Their reigns stretch beyond ordinary chronology. Their cities stand at the edge between archaeology and sacred memory. Their world belongs partly to myth, partly to history, and partly to something more difficult to name. Yet perhaps their deepest meaning was never meant to rest in literal certainty alone. In the oldest traditions, kingship represented order descending into a fragile human world. The king stood between heaven and earth, responsible for maintaining balance through ritual, justice, memory, and continuity. Whether the early rulers truly existed, as the tablets describe them, is one question. Another question, quieter and perhaps more enduring, is why ancient civilizations imagined leadership in such sacred terms at all. The answer may lie in vulnerability. Mesopotamian cities depended on cooperation to survive. Rivers had to be controlled. Canals required maintenance. Crops needed protection. Rituals held communities together beneath unpredictable skies. In such a world, the collapse of order could feel terrifyingly close. The sacred king became a symbol of stability against chaos. He represented humanity's hope that life was not random, that the world possessed structure beneath uncertainty. This symbolism appears repeatedly in the flood traditions. Before catastrophe, there is kingship, there is order, there are cities arranged beneath divine patterns. The flood interrupts that balance, and afterward civilization must begin rebuilding its connection to meaning again. Perhaps this is why the earliest rulers were remembered with such immense reverence. Their age represented proximity to origins. The farther humanity moved from the first beginning, the more sacred that beginning became. And even now, the emotional force of those old records continues quietly. Modern people still search for foundations beneath uncertainty. We still ask where order comes from, how civilizations survive, and whether human beings have forgotten something essential about themselves over time. The buried kings remain compelling because they stand inside those questions. They remind us that ancient people were not only recording rulers, they were trying to understand what allows human civilization to endure at all beneath the endless movement of time, water, and memory. Between heaven and earth, the ancient king stood as more than a man with a throne. He was imagined as a point of contact, a living center where divine expectation and human need met inside the fragile space of the city. In Mesopotamian thought, the world was not divided cleanly into sacred and ordinary realms. The river, the field, the temple, the palace, and the stars all belonged to one woven order. This is why the ruler's duties carried symbolic weight. He offered gifts to the gods, restored shrines, protected canals, judged disputes, and appeared in rituals that linked the community to powers beyond human sight. These acts were practical, but they were also spiritual. Repairing a canal could mean preserving food for the people. Restoring a temple could mean renewing the bond between earth and heaven. The king therefore became a bridge figure. He did not control the gods, and he did not stand apart from humanity. Instead, he occupied the uneasy middle ground between the two. His authority depended on maintaining balance. If the city prospered, it could be read as a sign that order was intact. If famine, war, or flood arrived, people might wonder whether that order had weakened. This way of thinking helps explain why the pre-flood kings feel so distant and luminous in the records. They are not remembered only as administrators. They belong to a sacred geography of beginnings, when the first cities were thought to stand nearer to the divine source of civilization. Their enormous reigns, strange names, and placement before the flood all make them feel like guardians of a lost connection. For modern listeners, this image can be understood symbolically without losing its power. Every society looks for a bridge between what it can control and what it cannot. Ancient Sumer placed that bridge in kingship, ritual, and sacred order. The king carried the hope that human life could be aligned with something larger than fear, hunger, and time. Perhaps that is why these records still breathe with quiet reverence. They preserve the old human desire to believe that leadership, at its highest, should protect meaning, not merely command obedience, especially when darkness gathers around the city. But a bridge can weaken, a bond can fray. And in the old flood traditions, the connection between heaven and earth begins to tremble before the waters finally arrive in the dark distance. In the flood traditions of Mesopotamia, catastrophe does not appear without warning. Long before the waters rise, there is already a sense that balance has weakened. The sacred order connecting kingship, humanity, and the divine world begins to strain beneath pressures that the stories describe through different symbols and emotions. In the Atrahasis tradition, humanity becomes too loud, too numerous, too disruptive to the order established at creation. In later interpretations, moral corruption and spiritual disorder grow across the earth before the flood arrives. Even where details differ, the deeper pattern remains similar. The world loses harmony before it loses stability. This theme carries emotional depth because ancient civilizations understood how fragile order truly was. A city depended on countless invisible balances holding together at once. Rivers had to flood correctly. Harvests had to survive. Trade routes had to remain open. Leaders had to maintain trust and ritual continuity. Once enough fractures appeared, collapse could spread quietly through the foundations of society, long before walls actually fell. The flood becomes the ultimate image of that collapse. Water ignores borders. It enters temples and houses alike. It dissolves distinctions between sacred and ordinary space. The carefully ordered world of canals, archives, rituals, and dynasties sinks beneath forces no ruler can command. Yet the stories are rarely filled with bitterness alone. There is sadness in them, but also recognition. Human order is temporary. Every civilization eventually confronts limits it cannot fully overcome. The flood simply gives this truth a sacred and unforgettable shape. Perhaps this is why the old records feel strangely relevant even now. Modern societies also build systems believing they will endure indefinitely. We construct cities, archives, technologies, and institutions as though permanence can be secured. Yet history repeatedly reminds humanity that stability is never guaranteed forever. The ancient scribes understood this deeply. That is why they preserved both the greatness of the first kings and the collapse that followed them. To remember only glory would have been incomplete. The flood was part of the truth as well. And after the waters pass through the old world, something unexpected happens. The stories do not end. Symbols remain. Names remain. The memory of the First Age continues, moving quietly through later civilizations like a submerged current beneath history itself. Empires disappear more completely than the people living inside them can imagine. A city filled with voices, markets, music, laws, rituals, and daily routines may one day become only a low mound beneath open sky. The walls collapse first, then the roofs, then the names begin fading from memory until only fragments survive in damaged texts or buried stone. Yet, symbols often outlive the cities that created them. This may be why the pre-flood kings continue to linger in human imagination long after the world that first named them disappeared. The kings themselves became more than rulers over time. They turned into symbols of beginnings, sacred order, lost wisdom, and the fragile continuity of civilization. A symbol survives because it can move between generations even when facts are uncertain. A ruined temple may vanish beneath sand, but the idea connected to it can continue traveling through stories, rituals, and cultural memory. The flood becomes more than a historical possibility. It becomes the image of interruption itself. The sacred king becomes more than a political figure. He becomes the guardian of balance against chaos. Ancient civilizations understood this instinctively. That is why they carved names into stone, copied lists onto clay, aligned temples with stars, and filled myths with repeated patterns. They were trying to preserve meaning against the erasing movement of time. Perhaps modern people are not so different. We also build monuments, write histories, store records, and search constantly for continuity with the past. Beneath all of it lies the same quiet fear. That memory may vanish if it is not carried carefully forward. The buried records of Sumer reveal how old that fear truly is. Even 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, scribes were already looking backward into a past they could no longer fully recover. The first kings belonged to an age that felt distant even to them. And maybe that is the final emotional truth hidden beneath the flood stories. Human beings have always sensed that something slips away with time, no matter how carefully it is preserved. Yet they continue telling stories anyway. They continue speaking the old names into darkness, hoping that meaning can survive a little longer than stone, water, or empire. Beneath every civilization rests another layer of silence. The streets we walk today cover older roads. Modern cities rise over forgotten foundations. Languages disappear, rituals fade, and entire ways of understanding the world sink gradually beneath the surface of memory. Most of the human past has vanished without leaving clear records behind. Perhaps this is why the buried kings of Sumer continue to feel so haunting. They stand near the edge of what can still be remembered. Beyond them lies darkness, not because nothing existed there, but because time has carried so much away. The ancient scribes seemed aware of this. Their records do not speak with the confidence of people who believe history is complete. Instead, the tablets often feel like attempts to gather fragments before they disappear entirely. Names are preserved, cities are listed, floods are remembered, but around those surviving pieces stretches enormous uncertainty. Modern archaeology has revealed only a small portion of the ancient world. Beneath deserts, riverbeds, forests, and seas may rest countless traces of civilizations whose stories were never written down or whose records have not survived. Most human lives leave almost nothing behind. A clay shard, a broken wall, a seal impression buried beneath mud, and yet human beings continue searching. There is something deeply moving in that search. People travel across ruined landscapes, brush dust from inscriptions, translate damaged lines, and spend years reconstructing fragments because they feel that the past still matters, not only for information but for meaning. Ancient history reminds us that human life has always unfolded inside uncertainty. The flood traditions, the impossible kings, the buried tablets, and the sacred cities all point toward the same realization. History is larger than the narrow portion we can clearly see. The official timeline is not false, but it is incomplete. Around it stretches a vast landscape of forgotten memory, symbolic truth, and vanished experience. For the night listener, this realization does not need to feel frightening. It can feel peaceful instead. Human beings have always lived inside mystery. The ancient world accepted this more easily than the modern world often does. The first kings were remembered, not because every detail could be proven, but because they carried the feeling of origins, loss, and continuity across immense stretches of time. And somewhere beneath the earth tonight, the buried records remain patient in the dark, still waiting for human hands and wondering minds to return once more. Civilizations often imagine themselves as permanent while they are alive. Their roads feel enduring, their laws appear stable, their monuments seem too large to disappear. Yet history moves in cycles more often than human beings wish to admit. Cities rise slowly from cooperation, memory, labor, and belief, and over centuries they can weaken just as quietly through drought, conflict, neglect, shifting rivers, or simple exhaustion. The ancient world understood this rhythm deeply. Mesopotamia itself witnessed kingdoms appearing, flourishing, fragmenting, and vanishing across thousands of years. One city would dominate the plain for a time, then decline while another inherited power. Temples were rebuilt atop older temples. Dynasties claimed connection to rulers whose names already belonged partly to legend. This repeating pattern may explain why flood traditions became such powerful symbols. The flood compresses the entire cycle of civilization into one overwhelming image. A world is built, order grows, human beings believe they have secured permanence. Then the waters come, and history begins again beneath altered conditions. For some listeners, this may invite thoughts of forgotten civilizations hidden somewhere beneath the earth or sea. Such possibilities should be approached carefully. Ancient stories are not maps waiting to reveal lost technological empires. Yet they may preserve another kind of truth, the understanding that human memory is far shorter than human experience itself. Entire cultures can disappear while leaving only scattered traces behind. Even within recorded history, enormous gaps remain. Libraries burn, languages die, archives collapse into dust. Most lives vanish without record. The buried kings of Sumer survive partly because clay endured where wood and cloth could not. And perhaps this is what gives the old flood stories their lasting emotional force. They remind humanity that continuity is fragile. Every generation inherits a world already shaped by countless forgotten people whose names no longer survive. Yet there is also comfort inside this cycle. Human beings continue rebuilding. After collapse comes another city, another language, another attempt to create meaning beneath the stars. The rivers keep moving. The stories return in new forms. Memory survives imperfectly, but it survives. And somewhere within those repeating cycles, the old records of the first kings continue whispering that history may stretch much deeper into the shadows than any civilization fully realizes, while it still stands in sunlight. The buried records of the ancient kings matter, even if they are never solved completely. Their importance does not depend on proving every reign length or identifying every ruler with certainty. The tablets endure because they preserve something older and more human than perfect historical detail. They preserve the desire to remember. In the world of ancient Sumer, memory was fragile. Cities could vanish beneath mud. Floodwaters could scatter entire communities. Dynasties rose and fell beside unpredictable rivers. Against that uncertainty, scribes pressed names into clay with remarkable patience, preserving traces of people and traditions they believed should not disappear entirely from the earth. That act alone carries meaning. The pre-flood kings remind us that history is not only a collection of facts, it is also a relationship between the living and the forgotten. Ancient people looked backward just as modern people do now. They wondered about beginnings, sacred order, lost wisdom, and the possibility that humanity once stood closer to origins than it does in the present age. The flood stories deepen this emotional connection. Water becomes the great divider between memory and oblivion, between the first world and the world afterward. Yet even after catastrophe, something survives. A story, a name, a fragment of clay hidden beneath darkness for thousands of years. Perhaps this is why listeners continue returning to such mysteries late at night. These stories slow the modern world for a moment. They remind us that human beings have always searched for continuity beneath uncertainty. Ancient scribes, temple priests, storytellers, archaeologists, and quiet listeners, separated by millennia, all become part of the same long chain of remembering. There is no need to force certainty onto every unanswered question. The buried kings remain powerful precisely because they stand at the border between what humanity knows and what humanity senses, but cannot fully recover. They invite curiosity without demanding rigid belief, and maybe that invitation is enough. The records survive not to close the mystery forever, but to keep it alive gently across time, waiting for each new generation to uncover the old names again beneath dust, silence, and the endless movement of history. If you are listening at night, somewhere between waking thought and sleep, you may understand why these old stories lasted so long. They do not ask you to solve them all at once. They move slowly like dark water under a moonlit sky, carrying names, ruins, kings, and questions from one age into another. Perhaps that is what makes ancient history feel different in the quiet hours. During the day, the past can seem like information, dates arranged in books, objects placed behind glass, maps marked with vanished kingdoms. But at night, the same past becomes more intimate. A broken tablet feels less like an artifact, and more like a message sent by people who also feared forgetting. The Sumerian scribes could never have imagined every listener who would come after them. They could not picture modern rooms, dim screens, headphones, or a person resting while their words drift softly through the dark. Yet the impulse remains connected. They preserved names because they believed memory mattered. We listen because we feel, in some quiet part of ourselves, that it still does. For seekers of old questions, the buried kings are not only figures from a remote civilization, they become mirrors. They ask why human beings keep searching backward. They ask why origins matter. They ask why a story from clay, flood, and silence can still reach a mind thousands of years later and make it pause. Maybe each listener carries a small version of that same ancient longing, to know where we came from, what was lost before us, and whether history is deeper than the surface we usually see. So let the thought remain gentle. Let the ruins stand in darkness. Let the old rivers move through the plain. The first kings do not need to be fully understood tonight. It is enough to follow their names a little farther, toward the final silence where the records remain buried. Still patient, still waiting, still holding the soft weight of questions older than every familiar road we walk today now. Far beneath the shifting deserts of Mesopotamia, beneath collapsed walls, broken courtyards, and layers of ancient river mud, the buried records still rest in darkness. Some tablets remain whole, sealed away by accident and time. Others survive only as fragments, carrying half a sentence, a damaged king's name, or the faint outline of a story copied by hands long turned to dust. The earth has become their final archive. Above them, empires rose and vanished, one after another. Languages changed. Religion spread across continents. New cities replaced old ones. Yet beneath all of it, the tablets waited quietly, hidden from sunlight, for thousands of years while history continued moving overhead. There is something peaceful about that patience. The records do not struggle against forgetting. They simply endure where they can. Some are discovered and translated. Others remain buried beyond reach, perhaps forever. Human knowledge expands slowly, one excavation, one inscription, one careful translation at a time. And maybe that is fitting. The oldest questions have never revealed themselves completely. Every answer uncovers another layer beneath it. Archaeology opens one doorway while revealing 10 more still sealed in shadow. The buried kings remain suspended between memory and mystery, never fully disappearing, never fully returning. Perhaps this uncertainty is part of their meaning. Ancient people did not always seek the sharp certainty modern societies often demand. They lived more comfortably beside symbolic truth, sacred memory, and unanswered questions. A flood could be historical and spiritual at the same time. A king could be both human and larger than history. A story could preserve emotional truth, even when details blurred with age. Tonight, the old cities remain where they have always been, sleeping beneath moonlit plains and distant stars. The rivers still move through the land that once carried the first kingdoms of Sumer. Wind still passes over abandoned mounds where temple walls and buried rooms continue sinking slowly into silence. And somewhere beneath that silence, the ancient records wait patiently in the dark, holding the names of kings who were said to rule before the flood, before familiar history, before memory itself began fading into myth.